Welcome to the Mike Litton Experience Podcast. Mike has over 31 years experience in real estate, finance, and investing. He's passionate about being a father, a teacher, a realtor, an investor, and a leader. Everyone has a story, and our passion is to help them tell it. And now, introducing the host of the Mike Litton Experience, Mike Litton.
So what can you expect from the Mike Litton Experience? You can expect stories that will inspire, motivate, advice that will sharpen your focus, and expert information on real estate, finance, and market conditions. Mary Beth O'Connor, thank you so much for being our guest on the Mike Litton Experience. I'm super excited for our time together, and I'm most excited about sharing your story of triumph with everybody out there that's listening to this podcast. Like we talked about before we hit record, everybody has a story, and our passion is to help them tell it. So with your permission, we're going to start with where you were born, go all the way up to today. And we want to talk about the amazing things you're doing with your books you're writing and all the speaking and all this teaching and leading that you're doing. I'm super excited to have you here. Thanks for being here.
Well, thanks. I'm really looking forward to it.
So where were you born?
I was born in Philadelphia, but I grew up in Central Jersey.
Okay.
Yeah, I lived.
So
My family was from there, and I lived there until I came to college. I moved to the Bay Area, which is where I live now,
the Bay Area of,
San Francisco.
oh,
So,
okay. So the Bay Area of
yeah,
California. Okay.
yes. I went to Berkeley, and I never left. That's the short
Oh, there
answer.
you go. There you go. They got their hooks in you, did they? I love Northern California. My son's actually up there. He works up there and lives up there. So you grew up in South Jersey. What was your favorite thing about growing up there?
I mean, I grew up in a smaller town, and it was very much a neighborhood where you knew all the kids locally. We hung out a lot together. For a lot of my youth, I lived on a dead end street that was sort of isolated from the rest of the town, and that meant that we were really close, and we all sort of had to play together because it was just like a group of like 10 of us, and we were too young to go much further away. But also in New Jersey, I really had a very positive experience in school, and so that was my sort of my one happy place. And I really enjoyed the attention I got from teachers and the encouragement. Definitely, that was my place of refuge was school.
That's awesome. So in high school, did you have a favorite subject?
I mean, I enjoyed history and English in particular, and I ended up being a history major when I was in college. Early American history was my area of emphasis, and but I also did have the idea of eventually law school because I was always told that I was argumentative and verbal, and that I would be a good lawyer. Now, this is from a family who has no college, right? I'm the first one to go to college, but that idea was planted relatively early.
So you got in an argument with somebody and they said, you know something, you should be a lawyer.
Not somebody's, many somebodies. You're beating the adults in the argument. Maybe you ought to be a lawyer.
Oh, I love it. I love it. That is so cool. So growing up in South Jersey, who was the most influential person to you?
On a positive,
Well,
on the
either. I
positive
mean, just
side,
the most influential period. Just who was
I
the most
mean,
influential person to you?
as far as having the biggest impact on my development, it would definitely be my mother and my stepfather, but more in a negative way than a positive way. On the
Okay.
positive side, again, it would have really been teachers. The teachers were the ones who sort of saw me and valued my natural abilities, my natural personality. So I definitely had a lot of strong positive relationships with teachers.
Gotcha. So after high school, you go to college. Where did you go and why?
I came to California because I wanted to get as far away from New Jersey as I could, one reason. But also, I used to get bronchitis in the winter. So I wanted to go to a top tier school where it didn't snow. And if you think about it for a second, there aren't very many of them. And
Yeah,
that's how I ended up in California.
that's awesome. So where did you go to school in California?
I started out at UCLA, but then I transferred to Berkeley and I graduated Berkeley undergrad. And then many years later, I graduated Berkeley Law.
Okay. So you go to UCLA. How long are you at UCLA?
2 years.
And what was your favorite thing about attending UCLA?
I mean, it was a very big change. It was a much more dynamic, energizing place to be. But I also really enjoyed the academic side of college. I'm sure we'll talk about, I had a very heavy addiction by the time I graduated high school. And in the beginning of college, I did better. So it was nice being exposed to new ideas, taking a wide variety of classes, and just being, surrounded with people who were interested in having discussions about what we were learning and new ideas and all of that. So I really enjoyed that side of it.
What made you transfer to Berkeley?
Well, I followed a boyfriend, but in my defense, I did tell him I wasn't going to downgrade my college to follow him. And so I transferred from UCLA to Berkeley. Berkeley's slightly higher ranked, but basically they're academically equal. And that's he did not go to Berkeley. I went to Berkeley, and so that's how I transferred.
Wow. So you graduate from Berkeley. Now, at some point, no, so you graduate with your degree in,
History.
okay. And so you have a history degree and you're basically on your way, for lack of a better term, you're kind of pre-law, right? You're kind of on your way to law school.
Yeah, so I did actually go to Berkeley Law right after I graduated from college, like immediately after. But my addiction, which had been very severe, in my teenage years, a little better for the first 3 years of college. It got a lot worse again in my senior year of college. And so by the time I got to Berkeley Law in the fall, I was in no shape to do it. I mean, I was just very strung out. I was very, using meth every day. And so I gave back a top 10 law school because of my addiction. And that was like an agonizing loss. I mean, I hated driving by the building. It was just very painful, but it was unavoidable. And so, yeah, law school right out of college, but I gave it back.
Okay. So let's talk about your addiction. So you started when?
I started when I was 12 with alcohol,
Okay.
and I mean, you have to really start before that, right? Like
Yeah.
most people who develop a teenage severe drug addiction, which today we call substance use disorder, I had a very traumatic childhood. There was a lot of physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal, emotional. And also, I didn't have a parent who was really bonded or connected to me. I was really on my own. And that primed me, as it does so many people, to develop an addiction early in life. And so I started with alcohol at 12. I quickly added in weed and pills and hallucinogens. And at 16, I found what became my drug of choice, which was methamphetamine. And I was shooting meth within 6 months in full bore addiction when I graduated high school. So it was a very quick and severe escalation.
So basically you got what you could from alcohol, right? And then it wasn't enough. Is that
Well, at first I just added the other things in. I still drank, and then I did weed too. And I drank, but I did pills and weed, and then did hallucinogens. But when I found meth, for whatever reason, it was chemically the best fit for me, and I was very hyper focused on meth at that point. So I didn't. I would drink once in a while, do something else once in a while, but I was very committed to meth when I found it. It was just the right biochemical fit.
gotcha? Okay. So your addiction's pretty bad as a senior in high school, and then you get into college,
Yes.
right? And you're in college, and I think you said your freshman year it got a little better. Oh, I lost you. We lost your audio.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can now.
Okay. For the first 3 years, I did better. I mean, don't get me wrong, I did worse than everyone around me. And other people were concerned, but for me, it was an improvement. But I still, did excessively, very chaotically. But in January of my senior year, after having had a very life-threatening kidnapping and long rape, 6-hour rape, 3 men, moved in with a violent boyfriend, very common trajectory for people with abuse histories. I started using meth again on a regular basis in January of my senior year of college, and I didn't get sober for 10 more years. So it was the beginning of another 10-year slide.
Okay, so you graduate college, history degree, you go into law school, you get into law school, you start law school. Talk about what happened.
I mean, I just couldn't get there. You know how you have those dreams where you walk into a test and you haven't been to class? Well, I was doing that. Like I was missing weeks at a time, literally weeks at a time. And I just couldn't concentrate. I couldn't focus. I knew I wasn't going to make it through. Like there was no way I was going to make it through. And rather than fail out, which was probably going to happen, I withdrew. I filed all the right papers and I withdrew because I knew I couldn't succeed. There was no way I was making it through all 3 years and then taking the bar.
Gotcha. Okay. So the next 10 years you're using.
Heavily. Yes.
So what are you doing for a living? What are you doing to try to survive?
So my terminology is that I worked my way down the corporate ladder, not up, down.
Right.
Because I couldn't hold a job. So I was
Yeah.
doing sort of administrative management type work at first. I'd be the office manager or run a department, an administrative department. But I couldn't get there and I couldn't concentrate. And so every job was like less money and less responsibility, and I held it for less time. So at the end of 10 years, my last job was word processing, and I only held it for 9 months. And that was a stretch. So I had a Berkeley degree, good grades, and I couldn't even hang on to a word processing job. That's where I was.
So what happens that turns the corner for you?
It was a combination of events, which is actually very common. So I couldn't hold a job. I was starting to have physical problems. Was emotionally, devastated. I was hopeless. I felt trapped, and my partner was ready to throw me out. And so it was sort of everything in combination that made me finally say, well, maybe I ought to go to rehab. And so I finally did when I was 32, 1993.
So how difficult was that decision?
I mean, it was frightening because I knew that my drug use was a pain management tool. I knew that I was using it because of all the pain from the many forms and many, many decades of abuse. And so I was really afraid if I take out the drugs, I really thought I had three choices. I can use drugs at that level, I could commit suicide, or I'll have some kind of a psychotic break and end up institutionalized. Like I really thought those were my only three choices. I was wrong, but that's what I thought. So the fear was around, what are they going to be asking me to do? How am I going to handle all this pain that I just assumed would sort of overwhelm me, if I got sober and stopped? So yeah, it is a very frightening experience for many of us. It is frightening.
Okay. So talk about rehab for a second. So you just make the decision to check yourself into rehab. Is it in California?
Yeah, yeah. It was near. I lived in Silicon Valley, and I went to rehab in Oakland.
Gotcha. Okay. Did you work while you were in rehab?
No, I mean, I went inpatient and it was a longer term program. I mean, so there are other options. If people don't have as severe of a substance use disorder as I did, not everybody needs to go inpatient. Some people can work and do treatment in the evening or with a therapist. But I knew that, even a 30-day program probably wasn't going to be enough. And so I went into a 90-day minimum women's program inpatient. So no, I didn't work. But in California, I had the advantage in that you can get disability benefits when you're in treatment, when you're in rehab, which most states don't offer, because I
Okay.
didn't have any money and I didn't have insurance. And so
Right.
it took me quite a while to find a program that would take me. And then I was on a wait list for 10 weeks. But I did have the advantage of being able to get disability, and it was sort of a low cost, semi publicly funded program.
Gotcha. So you go into rehab, which is scary in and of itself, right? And there's a period from, and I've never been in rehab, so I've never experienced this, but the people that I've interviewed, that I've talked to, and friends of mine that have gone through it, there's a period where it's just kind of like hell on earth. Like it's the first few days you're detoxing and you're trying to kick whatever it is that you're addicted to, right? In your case, it'd be meth, right?
Yeah, I mean, some people do detox before they go to rehab. And so, for example, you can actually die from withdrawal from alcohol or from benzodiazepines. And so, if you have a severe alcohol or benzo addiction, you often need what's called medically supervised withdrawal. Opiate withdrawal is very physically painful. And so, a lot of times, people, if they can get access to it benefit from medically supervised withdrawal because it'll reduce the pain and therefore increase the odds they'll complete the withdrawal process.
Yeah.
I was on meth. There is a a detox process with meth, but it's not as painful as some of the other types, and it's not as dangerous. But you're right. It's your body is reacting to having the drugs taken away, and certainly we all deal with the fact that our emotions are heightened. We're not used to dealing with them. We're used to having a solution that sort of numbs us out, and now it's taken away. And so all of that, in some ways, rehab's like being in grade school again because people's interpersonal skills are poor and their emotions are running up and down, and so there's a certain aspect to it that reminded me of being in grade school.
Wow, that's amazing. So how long are you in rehab?
I ended up staying for 5 months, and so I was in for quite a long time.
So what's the most important thing you learned in rehab?
um so my rehab was actually not the best fit for me. It was exclusively a 12-step house, and 12 steps is Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous and all of the anonymouses, and 12 steps is a good fit for a lot of people, and I definitely support 12 steps, but it wasn't the right fit for me, and they didn't try to find options. But what I did start to do that turned out to be a very good technique for me was I sort of took charge of my recovery. And so what I decided was, okay, they're offering me something that's not the right fit, but there are some parts here that I can probably use. And
Mhm.
so I read all the AA big book, I read all the NA, text. I participated in rehab, and I was just looking for sort of which of the ideas and strategies and suggestions, and that's how I view them, suggestions are being made that I think fit me, that I think
Well,
will help me. And that was a strategy that I started there that I took throughout my recovery that turned out to work really well. In fact, I just had 30 years of sobriety in January.
wow,
So there's
congratulations.
that. But also I had trauma, right? I had PTSD and I didn't know it. I had severe anxiety, and I had to get help for that when I got home. And it turned out that same sort of skill set of, listening, but being the decider and setting the plan and setting the goals and carrying out the plan, those skills worked in all the other areas I had to fix too. And I had to fix a lot of them.
Wow. So if somebody's thinking about going into rehab, what's the single most important piece of advice you have for them?
Don't wait until you're 100% sure. So I know on television, it's like people have this epiphany moment and they're like 100% sure they're going to get sober, they're going to get a rehab. That's not usually how it happens. Most of us are ambivalent. Most of us aren't confident there's even an option to get sober. I didn't believe it was possible for me to get sober. I was just trying to figure out how to use less so life would be less miserable.
Hmm.
It's not that I wanted to keep using, it's that like sobriety, abstinence was sort of beyond my imagination. And so it's normal for people to feel ambivalent. It's more normal for people to be conflicted. It's normal in early recovery for people to go up and down in their abstinence commitment. And it's also normal not to be perfect. And so like I used meth 3 times in my first 5 months. That's not perfect, but 3 times, and then I started the clock on my 30 years. That's still, pretty darn good. And so it's those kind of, let's be realistic about what the process really looks like, I think is the most important thing to understand.
And why do you think you used?
I mean, I used as most people do, as for a pain management tool. I mean, that's really what it was. It was two things. One is it helped me numb out my pain and forget about it and shove it down. But also it helped me have moments of happiness and joy that I hadn't really experienced. And so the thing about substances is that in the beginning, they seem to work.
Yeah.
And that's why you pursue them. But if you develop an addiction, it becomes like its own separate problem. And now you've got your original problem and you've got this problem too.
It takes over your life.
It does take over your life, but it's still meeting a need a lot of times. And a lot of that need is it's used. The two primary impetuses to developing an addiction are a trauma history or untreated mental health conditions, or both. And so that's usually what's underneath it.
Mm. So you're out of rehab. When you went into rehab, was part of your goal to go back to law school? Was that part of the design?
No, I mean, when I got home from rehab, my first professional goal was let's not get fired again. Like that's really where my head was at. Okay.
Well, you're setting the bar high.
Let's not get fired again. Maybe I can hold a job, like that
Wow.
was really it. And so when I got home from rehab, and I talked to newcomers about this, I had to be realistic. First of all, nobody was going to hire me for a career job. Okay. I
Yeah.
had an embarrassing resume despite my good grades at Berkeley.
Yeah.
So, but I wasn't ready either. And so my first job home was a part time, low level temporary administrative job because I needed to sort of get used to getting up on time, getting a shower, doing my makeup, going to work when I was supposed to be there,
Mhm.
staying all the hours, like not leaving at lunch and not coming back, right?
Right.
And then doing that over and over. That's really all that was I need to practice just doing that. Like that was where
Yeah.
I needed to start. So no, I had no thought of even being able to get back to law school, much less eventually be a judge.
Gotcha. So you start with this low level administrative job, right? You sort of learn how to get back into the flow of things and back into, you know, work mode, so to speak, right? Rhythm. So at what point do you make the decision to go back to law school?
So I, after the part time, my second job, and I think I had about 9 months sober. I got actually a permanent full time mid level administrative job, and then I got a supervisory job at a larger company, and I got a promotion. In the meantime, a few years have gone by, and also I did when I got home find a therapist with trauma expertise because I knew I had to address my trauma if I was going to be able to stay sober long term, but also to be happy and productive. So I was working on that
Did you address the trauma during rehab?
a little. I mean, I went to a lower level rehab. So we had
Gotcha. Okay.
somebody who was in a student trainee
Oh,
counselor, right? Because that's
wow.
what we got. So they did talk to us a bit about how our mental health and our trauma would have an interplay and sort of encourage us to address it later, right, when we got out.
Right.
And so I mean, I did. I found a therapist with the right expertise, and I started with her when I got home. And
Awesome.
I will also say that, like many of us, it took many more years for my mental health to be mostly recovered
Mm.
and less time for my substance use disorder to get stabilized. And that's common because my trauma was more complicated and it came first. And so it
Yeah.
took longer to resolve.
Gotcha. So you're working, and I think you said mid-level management, right?
Mhm.
You get a promotion. You're now, doing better. You're flourishing, that kind of thing, right? You're going through therapy. You're doing all the things you need to do to try to recover. And at some point, you make the decision to go back to law school. What was it that precipitated that? Was there an event that happened? Was it something with therapy? Like, did your therapist say, "Hey, you need
Well,
to
I
do
mean,
this?" Yeah.
it was sort of in the back of my mind, but I was really afraid. What if I try again and fail again? There's that. But will they even take me back?
Yeah.
When I have to explain what happened last time. And so but I also wasn't ready for a long time. But as the years went by, and at around 5 years sober, I'm now in my late 30s, and I
Mhm.
really thought about it. And when I got that promotion, I didn't really want the next job up, you know what I mean? And so I thought, well, if I don't want the next job here, then I'm in the wrong place. So
Right.
what do I need to do? And then I thought, you know what? Either I'm going to get in law school or I just admit that I'm not. Like I'm
Yeah.
getting old enough that I either got to make a commitment or just say you're never going to do it. And so I applied and I went to law school when I had 6.5 years sober when I was 39 years old.
So, let me ask you this. So, was it something that was just sort of sitting there in the back of your mind the whole time going, "Hey, you really should finish this. You really should do this. You need to get your law degree?"
I wouldn't say the whole time, but certainly by the time I got stable and started, doing well at work and getting promotions, it sort of I started thinking about it again. Is this a viable option? I was still interested in doing it, but it's also a big financial commitment, and to give up 3 years of your life. And so there were a lot of factors, but partly I was just afraid of opening that wound, and applying and not getting it, or what would that mean? Would I actually be able to succeed this time? Those sort of lack of confidence or concern were in the background. But the more successful I was professionally, the more I started to think, well, maybe I should at least consider going to law school for real, like for real.
So is there a
Actually going.
so is there a type of law that you were passionate about studying?
I mean, I didn't understand all the different types of areas of law, although I knew that it was a degree that could go a lot of different places. I mean, again, I come from a blue collar background. I didn't grow up, around people who had law degrees. But litigate, I knew that doing litigation like trial work was something I was more interested in.
Yeah,
So that was the thought, is that to be a trial lawyer. Yeah.
gotcha. So there's that argumentative thing, right? Right? You need to go stand up in a courtroom and get after
That's
it.
right. That's right. And I was also a good writer. And so, and I knew that a lot of law was writing as persuasive writing. And
Yeah.
so I thought I had a good sort of natural personality or natural skill set that would help me be more likely to succeed. And so it was still on my mind. But for the first 3 years of sobriety, I don't think I thought about it at all. It was only once I started feeling more grounded that I started seriously considering making the attempt.
Sort of back into a routine kind of thing.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I was getting good raises at work. I was getting good bonuses. I was getting really good reviews, and I just felt like, and I was just I was more disciplined, right? With
Yeah.
time, I was just increasingly disciplined, able to manage multiple commitments, all the things that you need to do when you're thinking about taking a big next step.
So that's an important lesson for people to understand, right? You don't just come out of rehab and you're instantly ready to go back to whatever it was you were doing, right? It's a process, and you have to come out. And obviously, it depends upon where you go and what sort of rehab you go through and all that kind of thing. But it's a process, right? It's you sort of start lower, you sort of piece together your life again. You start learning how to, like you said, learning how to stay, at work all day, and making sure you're on time and doing the things you need to do. Those are learned skills that you have to go back and relearn, basically, right? And a lot of people take that kind of thing for granted. And you're really just little by little, you're sort of just piecing your life back together.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say a couple things. That one is that, today we talk about substance use disorder on a spectrum. Like it can be mild, moderate, or severe. Because it's a mental health condition, just like
Yeah.
you can have mild, moderate, or severe anxiety, right? And
Yeah.
so what you're able to do or where you're starting from can vary depending on where you're starting on that spectrum. But when I
Gotcha.
take the current test, the test in the diagnostic manual, I come out at the very severe end. And so people on that more severe end, usually it means they've broken more of their life. And so there's
Yeah.
more to fix and they're starting from a lower place. And so it is important for us. And when I talk to newcomers, I emphasize be realistic and be patient, because if people try to leap ahead too fast, that can actually bite them in the butt sometimes. And
Yeah.
then they don't succeed. And then they feel like a failure. And it can actually in the long run, it can make the whole process slower than if they were just realistic and started where they were. But if
Gotcha.
people are on the more mild end, they may be able to keep working when they're in treatment. They may not even, I mean, it just depends on sort of where you are. But for people like me at that severe end, it is usually a major process. It's also about setting your priorities, right? So when I got home, I made a list of all the things I had to work on. And by the way, it turned out it wasn't comprehensive. There were things that I didn't realize I needed to work on.
Yeah.
But even the list I knew was way longer than I could possibly attack on day one. And
Yeah.
so I had to pick my priorities, and work was one of them. And so part of it is really doing an analysis about sort of where am I and where am I trying to go? And then what are my highest priorities?
We hope you enjoyed another episode of the Mike Litton Experience. If you did, do us a favor, smash that subscribe button, tell your friends, family, and coworkers about our program, and wherever you get your podcasts, please leave us a rating. It helps us to connect with quality people just like you.
And that's a wrap. Another episode of the Mike Litton Experience in the books. Reach out to Mike on Instagram at Litton Realty. Want to meet with Mike? Check out calendly.com/Rio760.